In this episode, Edie and I dive into FDA's 2024 guidance on decentralized clinical trials. We discuss how this shift could transform clinical research, especially in oncology. So, what makes the 2024 DCT guidance a game changer? Are DCTs actually suitable for complex areas like oncology? Oncology trials at smaller sites? DCTs for both large and small sites? Why did the FDA opt for the DCT guidance instead of going for a regulation? What is the impact on the political environment? Let's get into it. Today, we're going to talk about the decentralized clinical trials guidance because it's been a big revolution in 2024 that's really changed how we're going to work as an industry, or at least it has the potential to do that, and how it applies in the context of clinical research.
For me, I think the biggest transition as we move to the end of the year, new year thought process is we're now going to get into the how. Who can use this? How can they use this? If there are areas like perhaps oncology, and I'm not trying to speak for oncology research, I'm just saying who might have been reticent or a little bit slow to adopt, whether that's due to the complicated nature of the trials, the concern for the patient safety, the need for the data to be consistent, all these different factors that are a part of this. It's not nearly as easy as just swooping in and doing it. Does this change something for them? Does this tick that box that goes, okay, the FDA is really saying we can use the HCP in unique ways. And can that be a game changer for oncology to be able to utilize this and move, frankly, even faster than they already do? So that's a good monologue of what's on Edie's mind.
In the context of oncology, can you actually do decentralized clinical trials 100%?
I think people get very caught up on it being almost a 0 to 100 binary experience where you're either a virtual / decentralized trial or you're not. And I would argue that actually the vast majority of folks who are putting this into action are in the middle. They're not exclusively performing a trial entirely virtually, and they're not exclusively doing it in the traditional only in-person face-to-face format. They're using elements that are allowed, right? This is where I actually really like how the FDA titled their guidance. I think a lot more goes into that than people think about. But you'll notice they don't say decentralized trials, they say elements, meaning essentially this can be a hybrid between one or the other. We're not expecting you to go, my trial is 100% in a virtual decentralized format, or my trial is 100% in person. And that's the first piece I would say is frankly a win in the oncology category. Because to be fair, even your most basic observational, low level intervention oncology trial is still complicated at best, like on an easy day. And that creates extra regulatory hurdles and compliance considerations in addition to logistics when we talk about moving into using different elements that are decentralized.
Larger academic medical centers are uniquely positioned to address a lot of these needs. Do you ever think that smaller sites can do that as well? Or do you think, okay, do you see a lot of small oncology research centers?
No. So that's your thing. Your first hiccup is you don't see a lot of small oncology research centers. Now, I don't think that means there's not sites that have strong oncology, patient demographics and a rapport with certain, pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, and are known. I will say oncology, even at a large bureaucratic center, can move faster than most. There's a certain element of that cooked into how they're set up and should be given the patient portfolio. But still, you can be nimbler and faster at a site. Your pro con on that is most of your sites can't support the level of complexity of oncology trials unless they are 100% supported or endorsed by some level of a health center or hospital, because it's just extraordinary. And the overhead on oncology trials is so much greater. Even just when you look at regulatory, like the number of submissions you have, the number of staff you would have, what it costs to keep a trial open when you'll only enroll X number of patients for a year. All of that negotiation, price, cost, risk is enough to send most PIs right back to the med center and go, yeah, you guys can take this at the cancer center. I'm good.
Are we basically saying it'll only apply to large academic medical centers who will use these decentralized formats? Or are we saying that using these decentralized formats, we can bring more smaller sites into the fold?
I'd love to say both. And I'd love to say that because of the following. So I think if, on the one hand, it will take them a little bit longer, but if and when your AMCs and your research hubs that have cancer centers decide to embrace and utilize this, I do think that they can learn from the smaller sites and the other individuals who may have been earlier to adopt or earlier to implement, and with that potentially be more successful long term in setting up outreach and community based ways to reach cancer patients that they're not reaching. When we talk about the smaller end of the sites doing this, right, is i I think that they will initially have, like, if we can get into really deep wells of, say, like the HCP recruitment angle, right? Where you have clinicians, like, take again Indiana. They're a predominantly rural state outside of the metro area. Um, you can't tell me there's not a clinician in every single county in this state who has a patient with cancer that they wouldn't love to potentially consider a clinical trial because they're out of other options, or because they think there's value in us learning from this particular case scenario and taking that knowledge forward, or maybe both. What and how and when they're going to refer them is a completely different conversation.
The interesting part of the DCT guidance for me is that the FDA itself is not willing to commit to the guidance. It's a guidance by definition. It's one thing to say, you know what, we can talk about federal preemption. We can talk about how we're going to try to run clinical trials based on what the federal government's willing to stand behind, except the federal government isn't willing to stand behind that. They could have very easily chosen to make this a regulation and make it binding, but they didn't.
Do you think this is more a matter of, because I have my own thoughts on why they do guidance versus regulation broadly, but I wonder if this is in one of the following buckets. If it's they really did consider making a regulation and said we outright don't stand behind it, won't do it, versus perhaps they said, look, we're leaning in this direction, but we know there's this is an election year where there's going to be a lot of changes. We know there's so much politics and bureaucracy there, it would take so much time to get a regulation, da 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 da. They see the runway is long and they go, look, we could get a guidance out faster and that would actually be helpful today, right? So there's that angle, where it's not so much they don't commit, it's a timing issue. It's a, look, we want to be helpful today, not in 10 years when we can finally promulgate this and get it committed. And then they may or may not still move forward with a regulation. They'd rather you have something today so you'll move on this, as opposed to staying stagnant for another 5 years while they contemplate a regulation. Like, I mean, some progress is better than none, even if it's not binding.
I think the FDA overall does a great job.
Oh, too.
But I think that this is not one of those areas I actually agree with the FDA on. There are guidances that are over 10 years old, that are non-binding, that are literally in draft form yet. I think it's the FDA knowing that their guidance has the same impact as regulation, so why bother? At a practical level, even though they cannot enforce by guidance, what they land up doing is they do policy by enforcement. So they don't enforce by guidance, but they do policy by enforcement. What I mean by that is they're not going to come in there and say, this is something that is mandatory for everyone, but we're going to call you out if you don't follow it. And we see that pretty routinely. You also take the position that, to your telemedicine point, there are areas that the FDA definitely should maybe pass their skis, for example. And what I mean by that is they may not be allowed to comment on telemedicine at a federal level because they may say that that is within the jurisdiction of the different states. However, you could set a baseline and say, this is what we're going to allow. And that's come up in the context of DEA type authorizations. In fact, there was one around prescribing and whether or not you could prescribe using telemedicine, prescribe controlled substances using telemedicine under the Ryan Hyatt Act.
Do you think that changes with the political environment? I mean, knowing that we, at least as it sits today, anticipate some significant changes around, the new director of the FDA, new director of NIH, and some of the shifts, given the election cycle?
I don't think that it's going to come from the FDA at this moment. I think it'll end up actually coming from DOJ. where
Mm,
my guess would be whether it's Trump, whether it's Doge, they would be fans of going, if you're saying it's not enforceable, why is it there? And pull it out. Now, I don't think that's the greatest idea in the world because at this point, they're basically key support beams to research
yeah.
as it exists right now. So
Well,
if
it's like
you're
you said, we treat it like regulation, and the
correct,
FDA can, they don't have to enforce it for every auditor that shows up at your door to treat it like it's regulation. Like
but
it's, I, yeah.
they'll call out that guidance is the funny
Yep.
part. They will
Yep.
say this guidance recommends blah blah blah. Why are you not following it? Well, because I don't have to. But no site
But
wants to
also,
say
who's going to say that? Who's going to say that to an FDA
exactly,
auditor or any other auditor? You're not going to say that unless it's
exactly right.
already so contentious it doesn't matter. At which point you're already, taking the
Yeah,
hit. So like you might
yeah,
as well point it out. Um, and I will say I think just for what it's worth for sites out there who are like, really, would you ever say that to an FDA auditor? Here's the thing. If it's already gone down that road and I'm already on the way to a 483 regardless, yeah, I might. And I'd probably put it in my response and point out that this was not mandated or required. Doesn't mean I shouldn't operate in best practice land as much as I can, but I was cited with a requirement that doesn't exist. And that was my objection. And apparently, the FDA is not training their auditors on what guidance actually is and is not. Because I think that it almost could swing the opposite way. Like you wind up having auditors and monitors, whether they're from the FDA or frankly, a pharmaceutical company or contract agency, who do really think that this is a required element in a way that they don't understand. And that it's just legally not technically. Doesn't mean you
yeah.
shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean it's not a great idea. Doesn't mean if you have all the resources in the world, I'm not going to recommend you do it. Doesn't mean I wouldn't love to show an auditor that you did it. But also, if we want to get really ticky tacky on was it required, that's a different conversation.
Yeah. If you like this type of content, please like, subscribe, share. It really helps the channel.